What is going on, everybody? Back again today to bring you guys another video showing off another sort of collection that I have, but also it's just kind of a top 10 list, but it's not, I think it might be more than 10 actually. But anyway, you can tell by the title, this is my favorite fantasy book series. So recently, with Amazon Prime launching or premiering their first few episodes, I think there's four now, of their Wheel of Time show, I got really hooked into it just off of the first three episodes. And when me and my wife flew home for Thanksgiving, I was in the airport and I stopped and I was like, I kind of want a book to read. And I thought of it, I was like, I think I'm going to try the Wheel of Time again. They didn't have a, they had it there at the airport, but it was like the TV show cover of the book, and I'm not about that. I want like a real, like the real cover or a real cover of it. I'm weird about my books. I'm really weird. So I went to the like Barnes and Noble in my hometown and I found it. Wheel of Time, Book One, Eye of the World. Started it. I'm on chapter 6, so I'm making my way through there, and I'm liking it so far. But it has also reawakened in me my love of fantasy and fantasy stories. In recent times, especially since I joined the Navy, I'm not in the Navy anymore, but I joined the Navy May of 2017, and let's just say, from 2017 up until very recently, I've been geared more towards the sci-fi just because it's a little more grounded. It is more grounded in reality. It's science fiction as opposed to complete and absolute fantasy. So, yeah, I've been a little more on the sci-fi thing just from being in the military and constantly having like superiors in my chain of command, like trying to, I had to stay on point. I had objectives that had to be met. I had goals that needed to be accomplished. I had stuff to do at work. It was a real job. Up until that point, it was always part-time jobs for me, and then going to school. So being a full-time student. So yeah, recently my love of fantasy has kind of toned down. There were a couple times during my time in the Navy where I picked up a fantasy book or two, but not a lot. It's been sci-fi for a very long time, but with this Wheel of Time, I'm kind of back on my fantasy shit, and I just wanted to kind of show off some of the fantasy series that I have. I have a pretty extensive book collection, both sci-fi, fantasy, and just fiction, and nonfiction as well. I love to read. I've loved to read since I was very young. Um, I was always one, not trying to brag. I was always one of the better readers in my school, just because I don't know what it was. I've always had a vivid imagination, so the stuff that I'm reading on the page, always been able to like visualize it in my imagination and almost like see it playing out in my head as like a movie. So that has always helped me. And then I started off reading when I was really young with the Harry Potter book series, uh, which we might as well just go ahead and talk about. So first one I'll talk about, Harry. They're not in any particular order in like a ranking system. However, I will bring up the ones that I know I like less. But Harry Potter, started this when I was like 10 years old, loved it. And my mom not only got me the book, started me off with the book. I have all the hardbacks, but I'm not going to show them all here because they're big and heavy. But yeah, she got me the book and she also got me the audiobook. And I followed along with the audiobook. So I kind of learned to read at that speed, which isn't fast by any stretch of the imagination, but it's fast for a 10-year-old. But that I learned to read at that pace, the pace of the audiobook. So Harry Potter I always liked just because it's considered kind of like almost like urban fantasy, where the magical, fantastical realm it parallels our own. It takes place in the same setting. It's just hidden from what is considered the normal human world. Uh, I've liked that stuff. I've read a couple other books in that like subgenre, like Jim Butcher's Dresden Files. I've read two of those. They're good. They're entertaining. Harry Potter just clearly takes the cake for it, though. I mean, it's Harry Potter. Um, One of the biggest things that I loved about it was uh, the 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 magic and like how it was cast with a wand. So in the later books, when the characters are like when the story basically delves in evolves into like a war, but in the wizarding community, I liked the way that like combat in this wizarding world presented itself. It was because even though it was magic, it also wasn't. It was kind of very much so like combat in our real world. I remember thinking about it at one point, especially when I first saw it on the big screen in the Order of the Phoenix movie when they duel in the Ministry of Magic at the end. I was kind of like, it's one weapon, they're using a wand, but it kind of this one weapon kind of fills the role of two real world weapons that we have, being like a pistol, like a gun, and like a dueling sword, maybe like a rapier or a cutlass or a saber. And because when the characters were far apart and dueling, they were taking cover and they were firing their spells at each other, and it came off kind of like a gunfight. But then when they were more closer, you saw them like they had to cast a spell and then block an enemy spell, and then cast a spell and then block an enemy spell. So it almost turned into like a fencing duel. And I thought that was really cool. I was like, oh, it's kind of like our real world. It's just because they have this magic aspect to it. They do what we do with two weapons. They do with one. They do both. It fills both roles. And just the universe that she crafted, this hidden magical universe that J.K. Rowling crafted, hidden amongst our real world, it was brilliant. There were a couple things in it though, like looking back on as an adult, that I kind of think is like, okay, did we really need the Wizarding World equivalent of that thing? Like, uh, I remember I rewatched all the Harry Potter movies with my wife like a year ago, and I remember thinking like, okay, Harry and Hermione were both raised by Muggles, and they went to Muggle school for like the first 10 years of their life. So like if I was in their shoes and all of a sudden someone told me like, okay, this new school you're going to, you have to write with a quill feather and a bottle of ink, I'd have been like, get the fuck out of here. And I'd have shown up to school with some Bics, like click click. I'm just while everyone else is like spilling ink and tearing holes in their paper, I'm just fucking cooking. Like I'm taking all the notes. Like why, I don't know, just shit like that. Like why are they writing with quill pens? You know, not everything in the wizarding world is superior to the Muggle shit. Like Muggles they got better pens. But anyway, shit that my brain thinks about. And then, I mean, but she also had the characters in there, like Ron Weasley's dad, who was, he was fascinated with Muggles, and the worlds were there and they connected, but at the same time they had enough of a gap, so it was the perfect balance. Um, I loved it, and I kind of love this old, almost like even though it's set in the somewhat modern world, I think it's supposed to be set in like the 90s. It has this old timey feel to it. All of the inns and the taverns and the banks and the shops, like everything has this like old timey fantasy vibe to it. Like even though like the Muggle world around them has like modernized and advanced technologically, because the Wizarding world has magic, they have not felt the need to advance as much with technology because in place of technology they have magic. And then in recent years, with her expanding the lore and talking about, she's introduced the idea like, oh, we're going to see the Wizarding World of North America, and they have the Magical Congress of the United States of America, and they have their own wizarding school in America called Ilvermorny. It just keeps growing and growing. So I don't think there's many people out there anymore, except maybe young people who just haven't grown up enough to discover this. But if there's any adults out there that have not tried Harry Potter, like you're doing yourself a huge disservice. One of my favorite fantasy series, can't say enough good things about it. So, moving on from there, these these two books actually, we'll go into this one. Uh, they are I cannot decide between the two of them, and when the third one comes out, I probably will not be able to decide between those two either, or it'll probably be a tie between the three. But right now, the King Killer Chronicle, the two books in the King Killer Chronicle series by Patrick Rothfuss are my favorite books of all time. I read both of these without stopping. I read this nonstop, put it down, finished it, and then just dove right into this and just kept going. Like it is such a good read. This guy clearly knew what he was doing. Like he came out of nowhere with his very first novel and just absolutely killed the game. Patrick Rothfuss is the king of modern fantasy in my opinion. And man, does this guy know how to write a very interesting and compelling protagonist. Kavoth the Arcane he's sick. Uh, can't say enough good things about it. King Killer Chronicle. so far it's supposed to be a trilogy, I think. So far these are the only two books out, and they've been the only two for a while. It's kind of like a Game of Thrones. I say Game of Thrones. I guess for this I should call it a Song of Ice and Fire. It's kind of that deal. Like he's taken his sweet time writing the last installment, and I almost see this kind of going the same way as the inheritance cycle. The inheritance cycle is it's often called young adult. We'll get into it, but it was supposed to be a trilogy. And then by the time it came time for him to write the final book, he had so many loose ends and unanswered questions that it ended up being huge, and he was like, I got to split this into two books, and it's going to be a 4 book series, and we'll call it the inheritance cycle instead of the inheritance trilogy. And that's what he did, and I kind of feel like this might end up going the same way. But one of the best read ever that I've experienced. It's so good, you will not be able to put it down. If you love to read, you will not be able to put this down. It's so good. I highly recommend it. So, The King Killer Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss. The first book is called The Name of the Wind. Second one is called The Wise Man's Fear. Excellent. Absolutely excellent. All right, and since I mentioned it, I guess we'll go ahead and talk about it. The Inheritance Cycle. I have all the books here. Let's start with the first one, I guess. First one being Aragon. A lot of people, if you were like in middle school around 2005 when this came out, you probably saw this in bookstores, in grocery, everywhere, anywhere you could buy books, you probably saw this because for a very short amount of time, this series was outselling Harry Potter. For like the first 2 books, this one and the next one, it was outselling Harry Potter because it was a it's 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 often considered a young adult fantasy series. Like you'll find it in the young adult section at Barnes and Noble. I disagree. I think this is high fantasy. I know the main characters are all young at the beginning and teenagers, but that's the same case as what I'm finding in the Wheel of Time, and the Wheel of Time is considered high fantasy. So I think this is high fantasy. And the guy who wrote this, Christopher Paolini, he wrote it when he was 15 years old, and it turned out fantastic. However, there have been criticisms. So this is the first book, Aragon, and that's the name of the main character. The main character's name is Aragon. And then, second book is Eldest, which I've lost the cover, the removable cover to it. I feel really bad. I love my books, but I might need to invest in a new copies of all 4 of these because these are kind of in shambles. The last 2 aren't too bad, but Eldest is the second book. So these 2, when they first came out, like both of them were top of the New York Times bestseller list, and they were outselling Harry Potter. But it was after this book that the flaw with this series was really became obvious, and we'll get into that in a second. Third book is called Brissinger, and this one, this is that filler book. Like I said, like the last 2 he had to divide into 2 because there were so many loose ends that needed to be tied up and so many unanswered questions. That's really what this book ends up being. It's just the tying up of the loose ends and answering the unanswered questions. And then the final book, which is called Inheritance, that's really the climax, the culmination of it all. So this is kind of a filler book to me. It was my least favorite in the series. I did find some parts of it interesting, like when he gets his new sword and forges it. That was cool. And then the final battles are always fun to read about, but up until that point, I was kind of like, I could give a shit about what's going on in here. But yeah, so the biggest problem with this series, the Inheritance Cycle, uh, for those of you who don't know, it's basically medieval fantasy Star Wars. There was this order of peacekeepers who used color-bladed swords, they were called dragon riders. They rode dragons, they wielded color-bladed swords, and they could also wield magic. So in other words, lightsaber and the Force. And they were the ultimate peacekeepers of the land, and one of their order betrayed them and killed them and crowned himself supreme ruler of the land. And it starts off Aragon, the main character, little peasant farm boy in a village, finds a dragon egg, and then this old hermit dude in the village who lives nearby uh, takes him under his wing because it turns out this old hermit dude used to be one of these dragon rider peacekeeper people, and Yeah, it's Star Wars. It's Aragon is Luke. The old guy in this book, his name's Brom. He's the equivalent of Obi-Wan Kenobi. There is some role meshing because like for a while there's a character in this series called Murtag, and at the beginning Murtag plays a little bit of the role of like Han Solo, but later on he turns more into like Darth Vader because the guy that is actually the equivalent of Darth Vader is already dead. Like it has its subtle differences, but it's medieval fantasy Star Wars. It really just that's what it comes down to. In this book, uh, it's Empire Strikes Back. Aragon, the main character, travels to this faraway area and he trains with a surviving member of this ancient order of peacekeepers who has managed to stay alive and stay hidden during this evil traitor's rule. And then at the very end, guess what happens? He has a duel. At the end of this, spoiler alert, but it's been out for a long time. He has a duel with a Darth Vader-like character. Like I said, that character Murtag. He has a duel with him in a battle, and there's a whole big. It's not quite a "I am your father" reveal because he's not his father. It's more of like a "I am your half." It's an "I am your half brother" reveal, but in revealing that they are half brothers and that they share the same father, he's telling him our father is the evil traitor from back in the day that betrayed the order. Uh, so it's kind of like a Darth Vader "I am your father" reveal. And about this point in time, after these two people, they were out selling Harry Potter and they were doing really well, but people started to catch on like this is very derivative. It's almost kind of copying a lot of previously done shit, and that led to him having to, in the last two books, really come up with some interesting new things that change it up. But at that point, it was done. It was not. People who were already fans of it they were still down to read the last two books, and they did, myself included. But in terms of it growing bigger and attracting more fans, new fans, it wasn't going to happen because people who saw it and thought about reading it, they thought about getting into it, they did their research, and all that they found was it's derivative, it's basically medieval fantasy Star Wars, and that kept them from getting into it. So the last two books saw a bit of a decline. I think they both sold very well still because enough people were already two books into the series and wanted to see how it ended up, myself included, but I don't think it was drawing in new readers at that point. So is what it is. It's still a great series. I still really love it. I still wish it would be considered high fantasy and not young adult fantasy. Uh, yeah, he did so much. The author, he did so much. He created like Tolkien. He created a language for the elves, a language for the dwarves, a language for the Urgles, which are basically like the orc type characters. What else? He designed the map and the world, and he did a lot of world building, and it all feels very unique, except the parts that you can clearly tell are ripped from Star Wars. So yeah, at Star Wars, Dragon Riders of Pern, there's a lot of stuff he ripped off of. The most blatantly clear one is Star Wars, but there's a lot of stuff that he kind of ripped off of. Still a great series, and if you're kind of new to fantasy, but you want to try some, other than Harry Potter, the Inheritance Cycle is probably where I would recommend that you start. So, that being said, if you feel like giving it a try, give it a try. Moving on from there, I read Inheritance Cycle uh, shortly after reading the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, I don't have the Chronicles of Narnia with me. I don't. I lost my old. I used to have a big copy of just all the books bound together in one volume. I don't know where it is. I don't know what happened to it. I've moved a few times since in the past few years, so it's gone. I'm probably just gonna have to buy a new one. But I read the Chronicles of Narnia prior to reading Inheritance Cycle. I was maybe 13, and the first of the new movies, Lion Witch and the Wardrobe, was coming out, and I saw that movie, and that movie got me into it, so I started to want to read the books. Now, the Chronicles of Narnia is one of those where it is considered high fantasy, but it it has not aged well. It just has not. It had a resurgence in the early 2000s because we were finally able to adapt it into a feature film with modern special effects and costumes and makeup artistry and props and stuff, and we were able to actually bring the world to life and make it look cool in a way that had never been done before. But it is such a story for children, and it has such clear religious connotations to it that a lot of people are turned off by it. I think in that regard. And then also it's just kind of old and dated, and the writing style that C.S. Lewis used is really old and dated, and it's not very accessible for, like, I struggled to get through it because I found it really kind of just boring and just blah, 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 blah. Like, I was like, get to the fun shit. Like, I want to see magic shit happening. I want to see cool shit happening. Battles. Let's go. And it's just just descriptive bullshit about the food and the land. And then when it finally did get to like battles and stuff, it was not described very well. It was like oftentimes it would be described in like just a paragraph, an entire battle in just a paragraph, or if it was a duel. I think the most descriptive combat sequence is when Peter duels King Miraz, but even that's not a lot. I remember in the book called The Last Battle, which is the last book, I went into this with such high expectations thinking it was going to be just an epic conclusion, and it really wasn't. It wasn't much of a last battle at all. And yeah, it's just not well done. Not well done. So I finished. It does not hold a special place in my heart. I still want to own the books, so I will probably buy a new copy. But like I said at the beginning, I'll acknowledge when one of them wasn't really one of my favorites, and the Chronicles of Narnia is not. I liked it when I was younger because it was the first time I'd ever encountered a story where the main character was they were kids, like, and the obviously me being like Peter obviously appealed to me as a character the most. It's like he's a kid. He's maybe like he's not young adult would be a bit of a stretch, but he's a kid, and he goes to this magical world, and Santa Claus gives this kid a sword and says, "Put on your big boy pants, bud. It's time to kill this white witch bitch." And like I was just like, "Oh shit." Like, we're handing out swords to kids and they have to like fight in battle. Like, it was the first time I'd read a story where even though the main character was a kid, they still had the responsibility to get shit done and handle business, and I liked that. So that's what drew me to it. I don't really need that in a story anymore. I'm 29 years old. It doesn't do the same thing for me as it did back then. So Chronicles of Narnia, it's not high up there. It still deserves respect, but it's not high on my list. So shortly after reading Chronicles of Narnia, I started to try and read Tolkien, but I ran into the same problem with Tolkien that I did with Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien is by far much more interesting than Narnia, Middle Earth and Lord of the Rings and Hobbit. It's much more interesting, but it's still that old 19 early 1950s writing style. Maybe even earlier, I'm not entirely sure. But it is a more interesting world, and also we stay in that world. It's not characters jumping back from like our normal human world to the magic one and back and forth. It's nope, it takes place in Middle Earth. That's where it is. That's the story. So it's more interesting, but it's still that old writing style that just doesn't hold up to me anymore. Like the Battle of Five Armies is like a page or two, and it's supposed to be such a big epic battle. The movie I thought really did it justice, except when it kind of veered off into like and really drug out Thorin's duel on that mountain with the main orc, because we can talk about the Hobbit some other time, the Hobbit movies. But yeah, the Battle of Five Armies was relegated to just like a page and a half, 2 pages in the Hobbit. So I actually have a lot of Tolkien here, and long story short, I did not stick with Tolkien at this point in time. I read C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia, and then I moved on to Tolkien, but I didn't stick with it because it was just more of that same shit. And very shortly after that, I found The Inheritance Cycle, and it was a better writing style, more action. Uh, Once again, it was a kid, of a young adult kid, thrust into this position of responsibility, and I liked that back in the day. So I kind of at that point in time abandoned Tolkien and Middle Earth and moved on to the Inheritance Cycle. But later on in my life, I went back to it, and I have the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, read those. I actually This was another series that I read primarily with audiobook. Driving back and forth between home and college, I had all the books on CD from like back in the day. So I actually read most. The only ones of these that actually have like creases in the spine is The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring. The Two Towers and The Return of the King, like the actual book copy, I barely cracked open. I read most of these with audiobook. And then I have not really touched any of these, but I have volumes 1 and 2 of the Book of Lost Tales, and then the Silmarillion, of course, and Children of Hurin. And I intend to get through all of that extra shit eventually, but I just don't know when. But the main thing is The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. That's what really matters. That's where the real story is. There's tons of good stuff in all this. I'm not saying there's not, but this is like the meat and potatoes of it, and I've read this. I will get to this eventually. Tolkien does hold a special place in my heart as far as fantasy series go. Uh, just because like he's like the fucking Stan Lee of fantasy. He's the Grand Mac Daddy of fantasy, and for that I have to give him the credit that credit. I have to give credit where credit's due. I love the world. I will say this though. If I had already seen all the movies, including the extended editions, by the time that I actually read the books. And if I had not had that visual representation of this world in my head already, I got it from the movies. If I had not already had that, what I'd seen, if I had not already had what I saw in the movies already in my head when I read the books, I would have hated them. I did hate them. That's why I abandoned them and switched to the inheritance cycle. But since I did have that visual representation from the movies in my head when I did finally read the books, you know, in the areas in the books where the battle was a little, it wasn't described, it was kind of lackluster, I could always just kind of fill in the gaps and make my own head canon and be like, fuck it, you wanted a more drawn out, detailed, awesome battle, you got it in the movies, so just be happy. So, yeah, that's my take on Lord of the Rings. Now, after the inheritance cycle, so it was Chronicles of Narnia. Then I tried Tolkien, did not stick with it, switched to Inheritance Cycle, and now with the after the Inheritance Cycle, I thought about going back to Tolkien, but I was at the bookstore one day and I saw, oh my god, I have too many of these. It's the R.A. Salvatore Dark Elf saga. Uh, Specifically, I saw this book on display at the bookstore, The Two Swords by R.A. Salvatore. And there's this badass dark elf warrior dude in cool armor with two curved swords fighting these orcs, whatever the fuck they are. And I was like, they say don't judge a book by its cover, but I've always taken that to mean that, like, you know, if the book has a kind of bland, lackluster cover, it doesn't mean that the story is bland and lackluster. However, in my experience, I found if the book has a sick cover, it usually means the story inside's also equally as sick. Only thing is, was I did notice when I saw it that this was book 3. So my dumbass, knowing nothing about Forgotten Realms, Dungeons and Dragons, or any of that at this point in time, I just thought this was a book series. I went and found, I saw it said the Hunter's Blade Trilogy Book 3. So I went back on the shelves and I found Hunter's Blade Trilogy Book 1, The Thousand Orcs. And this had an even more badass cover because it was once again this dark elf dude fighting all these orcs. It was even more visible to see him, and he's stabbing one of them. And I was like, well, this is badass. So I bought this and I started reading it. Looking back on it, I don't know how I got through these, starting with the Hunter's Blade trilogy, because I come to find out later that this series is extremely long. There's over 20 books in R.A. Salvatore's Dark Elf series. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 8 of them. And let's see here. 4 of them, several of them are signed by R.A. Salvatore. I actually met him and he signed them. And also, just for people to know, I asked him, he was at a Q&A event. I asked him, how do you pronounce Drizzt? And he's like, I asked him what's the right way to pronounce Drizzt. And he's like, I don't like telling people there's a right way because half the fun is hearing all the different variations people come up with. And I go, okay. So I had to reword my question. I said, okay, but you're the creator. You made him. So I'm going to view your way as the correct way. How do you pronounce him? And he said, I heard him not only just to me, but also talking to other people because he was giving kind of like a lecture uh, at the same time. I heard him say Drizzt. So the two Z Drizzt is Drizzt is the name of this character. The two Z's mesh together to make kind of like a S sound like in pizza. So it's Drizzt. That's his name. If you still want to go with your own headcanon version of it, that's fine. But I'm just telling you, from R.A. Salvatore himself, from his mouth, it's Drizzt. The two Z's kind of make like a S sound like in pizza. So yeah, and this is the sixth book I have, The Orc King. I found it used and it was pretty cheap, so I bought it. Still haven't read it. So I read the Hunter's Blades trilogy, which at that point in time was the latest three books in a 20-something book series. So I was starting at the end. Once I don't know how I managed to get through all of them and not be like, what the fuck is going on? I think a big part of it was I just didn't care because it was so badass. I knew enough. What I knew was this dark elf dude is the main character. He's awesome and he whoops ass. And I'll tell you this right now, R.A. Salvatore knows how to write a sword fight. The amount of descriptive detail about all the different the movements and the footwork and the blocking and the parrying and the riposte and all the different he uses all the correct sword terms, and man, he can describe a sword fight or any kind of fight really. It's so descriptive. It was in my head. I was seeing it happen, and that's what made me love these. And that's what made it so that once I finished this trilogy and I found out that it was a bigger series, I went back and tried to start it over at the beginning. And I managed to get through the first three. This is kind of like the main character, Drizzt. This is kind of like his origin story. These first three books, it tells the story of his birth. He grew up in a really shitty part of the Dungeons and Dragons Forgotten Realms world, and he eventually breaks free of it and moves on. I don't want to give away too many spoilers in case anyone wants to try and read it. So I got through these three, no problem, because I was really invested in it. And then that was probably, when did I finish that? 3 years ago, when I finally finished the third book in that opening trilogy. And I'm still on the next. The next book after that is The Crystal Shard, which it was the first one the author ever wrote. He wrote this one right here first, and then he expanded on it and created both prequel stuff and sequel stuff. So this is where I'm at, and I've been on this book for about 3 years, and I just can't seem to just like commit to it and dive in. It's not that I don't love the series, it's just that I'm a fan of so much nerdy shit. It's really hard for me to divide my time. So I don't know. But the Dark Elf Legacy Saga, whatever you want to call it, The Legend of Drizzt, it's a great series. Especially if you already know the world of Dungeons and Dragons and the Forgotten Realms, you probably already know about Drizzt. But great series, great characters, great action, great description on the battles and the fights, top notch. So after the Dark Elf stuff, after I kind of like lost interest in that because it's a long series, my buddy at the time was reading. This is going to be difficult. I actually don't have my copy of the first book. I have all the others. The Stephen King Dark Tower series. This is, I'm going to go ahead and say right here, is, for a fact, one of my lesser liked fantasy series. So, give me 1 second here, folks. I have to, and I'm back. Sorry about that. Anyway, so Stephen King Dark Tower. It's one of my lesser liked fantasy series, and it is a fantasy series, even though it kind of has element of like the American Western frontier and stuff like that in it. It is a fantasy series, and uh, my buddy told me it was good. I started reading it. I didn't hate it. The first book was interesting. I found the world interesting, and I finished the first book pretty much no problem. I read through it and I was like, okay, can't wait to move on to the next book. I started the next book, and right off the bat at the beginning, spoiler alert once again, the series has been out for a while, but still, spoiler alert. Right at the beginning of the second book, they handicap they physically handicapped the main character, who was up to that point like this just awesome badass guy that I was really liking the character. Uh, the world that this takes place in, it's kind of like this weird post-apocalypse alternate reality of our world. They reference things like Jesus and King Arthur, and it's like a parallel alternate reality version of our world where things got really fucked up and the world kind of society collapsed and the world went to shit, and uh, there are these societies that have sprung up where there are it's almost like a feudal society. There's lords and there's a nobility class, and technology, specifically with technology, the use of guns and how to make and maintain guns, has been not lost, but it's limited to a select few people. And that's why the main character is a gunslinger. And gunslinger in this world that Stephen King created is like the equivalent of like a knight. Uh, you're a knight, you know. It's like it means you're kind of like of the nobility, but you're also of like the nobility and the warrior class, the elite warrior class. So it was all really good and interesting, but he's a gunslinger, right? And he uses these pair of revolvers, which are supposedly they're made from the melted down metal of the sword Excalibur, King Arthur's sword, and they've been passed down through his family because this main character is a descendant of King Arthur. And unless I'm mistaken, I'm not entirely sure I'm remembering this correctly, but I think it's as long as the two revolvers that are made from Excalibur, as long as they are wielded by a member of Arthur's bloodline, they will pretty much, there's like a magical quality to them, they will never miss. So he's a gunslinger with these revolvers that basically guarantee he's never going to miss. I mean, he's an elite, highly trained marksman anyway, and then he's got the magic guns on top of that. But then right at the beginning of the second book, this like he falls asleep on a beach and he wakes up and there's these like sea creatures and one of them like clips his two fingers on his right hand off. So now it doesn't matter how well trained he is or how magical the guns are, he cannot shoot with his right hand. They immediately just he can shoot with his left still just as well, but it's not the same. You know, I hate it. I hate it. I hate it when a awesome character that is just badass and cool and then the writer handicaps them like that. I hate that. It's like you just hey, were you trying to just ruin everyone's arguably people's favorite character and your most interesting best character? Were you just trying to ruin them? Because if so, you did it. Good job, stupid ass motherfucker. Yeah, handicapping the main character. His name is Roland. Handicapping Roland right off the bat was just dumb, very dumb. And from there, the story got progressively worse. It was a lot of they were leaving Roland's kind of imagine like Middle Earth combined with the American Western frontier, the Wild West, and that's pretty much it. Yeah. So yeah, like a King Arthur-y medieval fantasy story, but set in the American Wild West. It's kind of what it was. It was weird, but it was interesting, and I found it interesting enough to keep me reading up until it became clear that in all these books, he's going to Stephen King is going to keep taking these characters out of this really interesting world that he's built and take them to other worlds. Like at one point, they go to another alternate reality version of Kansas City that is from one of his books called The Stand. And there's another part where they just come to our world, our normal world. There's a part later on down the series where the characters come into our real world and they meet Stephen King, who knows who they are because he's writing about them. It gets really, really weird. And the more he veered away from this cool fantasy Wild West world that he'd built, the less I liked the series. And he veered away from it a fucking lot. A lot. And by the time here's where the things really got to the end for me. I read books 1, 2, and 3, and I was at this point in my life I was kind of like, well, I started it, I'm going to finish it. And I picked up book 4 and I started reading book 4. There is a huge chunk of book 4. Book 4 is almost entirely a flashback. It's the characters sitting around a campfire, and Roland, the main character, is telling all of the other supporting characters his a good chunk of his story of his life from the past. And getting that After reading that, and it was all of it, it was his entire story that he told to the supporting characters. When you read it, it was set in his past in this cool world that Stephen King had created, this fantasy Wild West world, and it was awesome. It was, oh my God, it was so good. And then at the very end of this book, the fourth book, you come back out of that flashback story and you come back to the characters sitting around the campfire, and Roland's like, well, I'm done telling my story. And then you're expected to just go back into this weird fucking acid trip of a story that Stephen King is writing. And I was like, no, I want to stay in this cool fantasy Western world that you've made. Stop taking us out of it. Stop taking us to our real world. Stop taking us every other place. You invented this really cool world with like gunslinger noble knights and this post-apocalypse world, and there's an evil dark villain, kind of like a Satan devil type figure who has a acolyte who's kind of like a Darth Sidious, Darth Vader kind of dynamic going on. It's and Roland is constantly Roland's goal is to get to the Dark Tower. That's why it's called the Dark Tower. The Dark Tower is the linchpin of all reality. And Roland thinks that if he can get there, the tower will have whatever he needs to set the world right, to set reality right, and fix it all. He thinks he'll find it at the tower. And it's so interesting and so good. But then at this point, after getting so much of Roland's world and then being taken back out of it again, I was kind of like, oh, I think I'm done. I think I'm done. And I took a break from this series for a while. Then, a few years later, they started making these. These are this is a comic book series of Stephen King's The Dark Tower, and it's a prequel series. It covers, but it's just about, once again, the main character is Roland. Same main character is Roland. This is the first volume, the first graphic novel in this prequel comic book series, and it starts the day that Roland becomes a gunslinger and he earns the right to carry guns. So he's like 14, I think. And it goes from there all the way up to pretty much the beginning of the first actual novel. And I found these, and it was more of, you know, the past, Roland's life set just in that cool Western fantasy world. And so I read this and I loved this. All the prequel comic books are amazing. I highly recommend people read these too because they're really good, and there's a lot of detail in these and a lot of story elements in these that you do not get even in this giant flashback of a novel here in the fourth book. So these are very good, and I think most Dark Tower fans have read these and like these. But once again, this just even more, reading these just even more so, reaffirmed in my brain that Stephen King, you made a mistake by not having your story entirely about this world, this cool Wild West fantasy King Arthur world. It's cool, it's good, you were onto something here, and then you decided to just veer away from it so much, so often. You should have just stayed here. And these comics did reinvigorate my interest in the series for a little bit, and I went out and I bought, because at the beginning I bought all the books. I had all 7 of them, because I was like, I'm going to read this series. I gave up after the fourth one, read the comics. The comics, I loved them. They kind of got me interested again. So I picked up the 5th book, Wolves of the Kala, started reading it. I got to my bookmark, my old bookmark is still in here. I got about that far through it. That way, this is the beginning, obviously. I was this far through it, and I went, once again, we're not in the world that I want to read about. We're off in another alternate reality. He also, in this series, Stephen King considers The Dark Tower to be like his masterpiece series, and a lot of the worlds of his other books, like Salem's Lot and The Stand, the main characters of the Dark Tower series visit the worlds from those other books. So like in this book, we're pretty much all in this like I want to say it's Salem's Lot. I'm not sure if it's actually Salem's Lot or if there's just characters in here that are also from Salem's Lot, but it's it's not the cool Western fantasy gunslinger King Arthur noble knight world that he created. It's not that, and that's what I wanted to read about. So I gave it up. I gave it up, and to this day, I know how the series ends because I just finally told my buddy who read the whole series. I was like, just fucking spoil it for me. I don't care. And he told me, so I know how it ends, but I've never finished reading it, and I honestly don't know if I ever will. It is, it is loved by a lot of people, and I'm not gonna say there's nothing about it to enjoy, but it's probably my least favorite fantasy series. All right, what's next? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. It was right around this time, after giving up on the Dark Tower, that I finally went and finished Tolkien. But I've already talked about what I like my feelings about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, so we'll stay away from that. So it's right about this point in time that I discovered the Game of Thrones TV show, and then because of that, I decided I wanted to read the books. So I I got all the books. I have all of them that are out right now, except the prequel, and I don't know if I'm gonna read it. We'll see. I got all the books. Um, got through 1 and 2, no problem, easy peasy. Got through 3, no problem, easy peasy. The fourth one was hard because all of the characters, my favorite characters, the ones that I really gave a shit about, both because of just what I'd already read in the books and what was going on in the TV show, this was a pain in the ass to read the fourth book because none of those characters are in it. Jon Snow is in it for like a tiny little bit at the beginning, and then you never hear from him again. The whole book, he divided. I've heard, I'm not entirely sure about this because I never finished the fifth book, but I've heard that these two books, the events of these two books take place simultaneously. It's just what different characters were doing. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's what I've heard. But needless to say, Daenerys Targaryen, not in this. Jon Snow, not in this. Tyrion Lannister, not in this. It's Cersei and um, some of the other lesser known characters, like some of the people from the Iron Islands, uh, Theon's sister, whatever her name is. And there's some interesting like information that you get in here. And I'm not saying that like you can skip it. You obviously cannot skip it. You need to read it. But yeah, it was hard. And but I finished it. I powered through it and I finished it. And then I started the fifth book. And this book is pretty much Daenerys Targaryen, Jon Snow, Tyrion, all the best characters that we want to read. So I started reading the fifth book, and it was at this point that it became very clear that the books were going to deviate from the show a lot. And I had to admit that at this point in time, at that point in time, this was around the point in time where um, Jon Snow, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't watched the show, this is about the point in the TV show where Jon Snow, it was the season where Jon Snow had just been resurrected. He'd been killed at the season finale previous of the previous season, and then he was brought back to life. Pretty much at that point was when I said, you know what, I'm just going to ride out the TV show, watch that, and we're going to see if I ever want to come back to this. Because like so many other like I said about Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia, the George R.R. Martin does not do a good job, in my opinion, of writing action. A lot of the battles and like fights and battle scenes, you hear about them and you find out about them in passing. Like two other characters will be telling each other. One character will be telling another character about it, but it has already happened. It's not like you're there and he's talking about and you're reading about it as it happens. It's said in passing between two other characters referencing a past event. So that I don't really like. He does some battles for sure, especially in the third book, Storm of Swords. There's battles, but most of like Robb Stark, but when he's alive, most of Robb Stark's war against the Lannisters as he's pushing south, most of that is just talked about in passing. Like you don't get a lot of the battles of that. Um, yeah. And there was so much between by the time I got to where I was in this, let's see if my bookmark is still in this. That can't be right. This is the beginning. I could not. I don't think I was that close to being done. Maybe, but I don't think so. So anyway, by the time I gave up reading this, there was so much different between the books and the show, and I was just kind of like, I want to see where the show plays out because they're doing a better job of showing action and cool fight scenes and yeah. So I just want to see how that plays out. The show having now wrapped up and sucked. I am tempted to get back into this. I'm on Wheel of Time right now, but I'm tempted to get back into Song of Ice and Fire. Um, Let me know, people out there who finished all 5 books and maybe even have read the prequel. Let me know in the comments below. Is like, if I hated the show because of the way it ended, is this gonna fix the problems? Is this gonna make me happy? Let me know. So, with that out of the way, it's George R. R. Martin. I almost consider him like the modern Tolkien. Like his writing style is, he doesn't care about the action. He doesn't care about doing cool battles and epic duels between heroes and villains. He's just telling a grand story, and he's real big on descriptive detail. Like that's something I hate in books is like, oh, I cannot stand in books when an author gives a lot of descriptive detail about food. Unless it's some kind of weird fantasy dish or meal that doesn't exist in our real world. Like if they're talking about a feast and they're describing all the different fruit laid out on a table for a feast, it's like, motherfucker, I've seen fruit and I've ate it. I know what it looks like, I know what it feels like, I know what it tastes like. You don't need to describe all this fucking fruit. I know about fruit. So and he's that kind of writer. He's that kind of writer. And the fucked up thing about it is he's not bad at doing battle scenes. There was actually a the Ironborn, not Ironborn, the people from the Iron Islands, the seafaring people. There's a battle scene where they raid a village in this book, in the fourth one. And I read it and I was like, that was pretty good. Like that was actually a pretty well written battle scene. I actually liked that. Why does he not do more? I just don't think it's his cup of tea. I don't think he likes it. I don't think it's not what he wants to write about. Like he understands that in a fantasy world like this, battles and duels and fights have to occur, but it's not where his number one interest lies. He's more interested in like the the political intrigue and the what's the word I'm looking for? The underhanded, the betrayals and the alliances and the secret alliances and the underhanded deals and the plotting and the scheming. He's more interested in that and not outright like, you're my enemy to war. Like I don't know. But anyway, it's not, once again, it's not bad, but I would consider, for me, A Song of Ice and Fire is one of my least liked series. But that being said, it's supposed to be 7 books total, and right now we're only on 5 with one prequel book. So there's still 2 more books to come. There's supposed to be, and who knows? Maybe if it's vastly better than the show, I'll probably like it. I'll probably read it. I do see myself finishing this stuff at some point, but it's one of my least liked series so far as of right now. Once I gave up on that, though, I started looking for new stuff, and I saw this at Barnes and Noble. This is the Broken Empire trilogy: Prince of Thorns, King of Thorns, and Emperor of Thorns. This shit is so fucking good because it's got everything. It's got the Game of Thrones like subplots of like betrayals and alliances and sneaky scheming and plotting, and it's also got one-on-one duels between main characters and others, and they are well-written duels. Like the sword fights and battles that happen are well described, and you can really picture them in your brain. And then it also has a really, really interesting world and setting. This is our world after a post-apocalypse. This is 1,000 years after like the world as we know it right now in 2021 has ended, and it's 1,000 years later. And it's another one of those kinds of stories where like all not it's not just that our society collapsed and we had nuclear war, it's also that reality itself is broken. And there's magic exists, there's pyromancy, there's necromancy, there's a lot of different types of magic. There's dream magic, possession, mind control. So magic is real, undead are real, and yeah, like I remember seeing the first time I opened the book and I actually saw the map at the beginning. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this. Actually, I need to use King of Thorns. So if you see this, it's clearly, I don't know how well you can make it. It's clearly Western Europe. Like up here, this is what remains of the United Kingdom. This is like the like Spain going up into France and what's left of Western Europe. This is all Western Europe. The world has changed over 1,000 years. The environment has changed, climates, some seas, the ocean has risen in some areas, flooded some other areas. Uh, but yeah, it's our world, and I found that really interesting. It's like most of the times you talk about like stories about our world in the future, it's always sci-fi, advanced technology, interstellar empire. This is, hey, 1,000 years from now, we're gonna have regressed back to like kings and queens and feudal society and lords and nobility and knights and swords and but also there's like magic and shit going on in here too. The main character is he's a prince. He's royally he's royalty. He's noble born or whatever, but he's gotten shafted in life, and he's just on this ultimate quest of not both. It's revenge, but it's also just like ambition. Like he's like, I'm gonna own the fucking planet. Like that's him, and it's a story of him slowly, as time goes on, realizing maybe there's more to just conquering and ruling. Maybe I should chill the fuck out. And he slowly becomes a better person. He meets people who he's never had anyone loyal to him his entire life. He got shafted and betrayed and almost fucking murdered really early on in his life. And slowly, as the story progresses, he meets more people who are willing to be loyal to him and stand by him. And because of that, it gives him a little bit of like a redeeming quality. They tell him like, "Hey, man, there's something about you to love." And because he then feels loved and liked, he kind of becomes a better person slowly, a little bit, but not a lot. He's kind of a shitty person. He has no problem killing people when it suits him. And yeah, really great series. I have not finished Emperor of Thorns. I will say that. So I do not know how this one ends. Not because I didn't like it. It's just like I said, it's one of those things where, like I said, I just have so many interests that I bounce around between them all the time. But I will get around to it eventually. It's great though. Yeah, especially if you want a really interesting take on like a post-apocalypse society right here. So, the Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence. The books are Prince of Thorns, King of Thorns, and Emperor of Thorns is the last one. All right. Not much left here in terms of my fantasy collection. I think there's only one left, and that is The Witcher. So, I delved into The Witcher first and foremost playing the games. I played Witcher 2 on Xbox 360. I played a little bit of Witcher 3 when it came out, and I've played a little bit of Witcher 1. The one I've played the most of is The Witcher 2, and I really like the game. I like uh I like fantasy. I like any kind of video game where there's like a main protagonist. I'll take that over building my own character any day because building your own character, while it's kind of fun to see the progression, it's you just made that character from scratch, so there's absolutely no way that they can really have a history with the world of the game. Whereas if you're playing as Geralt of Rivia, you are Geralt of Rivia, and Geralt of Rivia has this long-standing history with this fictional world, this fictional universe. He is a part of it, and he's been a part of it for a while. So I like that more from a story perspective, and I'm all about story. But towards I want to say the end of 2018, I knew I had a deployment coming up with my ship, so I decided I'd go ahead and I was like, I'm gonna get into The Witcher. I'm gonna really get into it. So I bought the first three books. Uh, they're good. I'm not gonna say they're not good, but just understand that they are translated from Polish, and the translators do a pretty good job. But there are some moments in there that kind of like jar you a little bit reading them because you're kind of just like, it's not that it's improper English, it's just that it's like that's not how that should be worded. So that kind of, and sometimes you kind of have to reread the lines pretty much just to kind of like get it to make sense to you. Like, what the hell are they? Oh, okay. And then finally you get it. What can I say about The Witcher? I mean, if it, The author does a great job. There's plenty of action. It's well described in detail. You can always, I never had trouble visualizing it. And then also between the games and now the TV show, you have enough visual aids and visual references to where like you could use the what you've seen in the show and what you've seen in the video games to kind of like fill in the imaginative visual gaps in your brain of when like action is happening in the books. So, and if I'm going to tell you this right now, if you like the books and or the games, you will, or no, if you like the TV show, the Netflix series and or the games, you're going to like the books. As long as you like to read. I mean, if you don't like to read, I can't do anything about that. But yeah, what you get with The Witcher in both the games and the TV show is it's what you get here. It's The Witcher through and through. So uh, the covers of the books are very stylized, and that turned me off for a while because I was kind of like, oh, is this a I knew that the books came first and then they made the games, but I was just kind of like, oh, is this it looks like expanded lore. It looks like like every once in a while a video game will come out and then they'll make tie-in novels to the game. It struck me as that visually. I knew it wasn't, but it just looked like that to me. And so yeah, I eventually I gave him a shot though. Really good series, very big fantasy series. Not as long as some others, like this Wheel of Time thing that I'm getting into, but it is a pretty long series. There are, want to say, 7 books in the Witcher series so far, and I don't think he's done writing them. I think there's going to be more, because the way they've set it up is like the games. The games are the end. The Witcher video games are the end of Geralt's story, from what I understand, and but they on purpose they created the games to take place at a time in Geralt's life far into the future, and it's an undisclosed time in Geralt's future. So they left an ambiguous, unspecified amount of time, like gap in there to fill with more books. So we'll see. I do recommend if you want a good actiony, fun fantasy series with a lot of content. The Witcher's good. It's a little the market for The Witcher's a little oversaturated right now. And I will say this from what there is of the show, this is where you would start The Witcher with The Last Wish. It's not really a novel so much as it is just like it's a collection of his like short stories that he did. This is where I would say start it, and a lot of what I've seen in the show is from this, and they do a pretty good job of adapting it. So yeah, The Witcher. So that is it. That is my favorite fantasy book series so far. I really am liking this Wheel of Time, Eye of the World book, but I'm only on chapter 6, and it's the first book in a 14-book series. So I would feel a little pretentious including it in here and being like, oh, it's one of my favorite fantasy book series. It's so great. All 6 chapters of it that I've read are phenomenal. Like it would feel wrong for me to talk about it yet. I will probably do a review of it though when I'm done with it, and we will see if I move on to the second one or not. But yeah, so that's my list. That's my book series, my fantasy book series, my favorites. Let me know what you guys think. Anybody else have any others that I think I should include or any recommendations for me? If anyone has any additional questions about these series that I didn't answer in this video, please leave some comments below. If you liked this video, please hit that like button. It really helps out my channel. Another way you can help the channel if you want is check out some of my other videos, maybe subscribe. And other than that, I will see you guys next time.